Welcome everyone to our webinar. There's a lot of talk about the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. We wanted to give everyone a chance to see or to learn the overview of what's actually in it. So CPA's research team took the time and went through the most significant provisions, the good, the bad, and other things we're interested in that are about neutral. We want to go through it with you. You're all on mute. You'll stay on mute until the end of the presentation by me and Jeff Ferry, and then you will be able to ask questions, and you should have a GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. If at the end you have a question, you can either write it there or just say, I have a question, and I should be able to selectively unmute you there to ask your question. So the Canadians got into the agreement a week ago last Sunday, just before midnight, so it is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. It's not the NAFTA agreement, I think, because Bob Lighthizer thinks that these are agreements between countries. It's not something like creating a trading union, which is more of creeping, globalization in the terms of governance, where like the EU tried to do. So I think it's significant that the name is US-Mexico-Canada, and they stuck the A on the end for agreement, so it's not the U.S. Marine Corps. But this, of course, was a significant campaign promise of President Trump to renegotiate or terminate NAFTA. You may remember Obama promised to do it, but didn't. Several of our members, CPA board members and other members, are members of advisory committees, from the Advisory Committee on Trade Policy Negotiations, which is the more important one, to several ITACs, or Industry Trade Advisory Committees. And as you may have seen in a prior email, we urge you to consider whether you fit and want to be and would serve on an ITAC, because it's good to get our point of view in there as direct access to USTR negotiating staff. Overall, the USMCA is an improvement. Several items on our wish list were included, and of course on Bob Lighthizer, Ambassador Lighthizer's wish list. He put in a lot of innovative, new, aggressive requests to the other parties. Some of them were included, others were not. At this point, CPA has not taken a position on the agreement. We're working through some details. We have some concerns. I'll go over a couple of them with you during this call. We'll be working with USTR. We've been overall giving a positive message. That this is an advance. We do like the trade team. We want to be supportive. We want to give them more political space to do good things. We have similar goals to the trade team, we at CPA, but we have not taken a position, and our coalition of ag, labor, and manufacturing is, again, still working through some of the details. We tend to do things by consensus at CPA. On a positive note, The Economist magazine, the global defender of free trade for the last 200 years, says this agreement is a step backward for free trade. So that means there's some good things in it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. We're going to take some topics. We're going to hand it off between ourselves, and I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so we're going to start with rules of origin. The changes in the rules of origin are an important part of the new agreement. A rule of origin is the criterion needed to determine the national source of a product in order for it to qualify for the benefits under the trade rules here. So, and within the USMCA, there are new rules of origin that apply to the automotive products, chemicals, steel-intensive products, glass, optical fibers, and textiles. And I'm only going to talk about two of those. and start with autos. That's probably the most significant. The percent of content that must be produced inside the USMCA in order for the product, the finished automobile, to receive free trade benefits rises from 62.5% to 75%. That's a pretty big change, and one of its effects should be to reduce the amount of outside North America, largely Asian-made components that have shown up in a lot of automobiles. And it's notable that this clause has already produced positive comments and appears to be changing auto company strategy. I say notable because, as you probably know, the agreement is far from being ratified. Congress won't even look at it probably until next year. Nevertheless, I've seen in the newspaper quotes from senior executives at BMW, Mercedes, Mazda, and Nissan, all saying they're looking at increasing their production in the US and Mexico in order to ensure that their vehicles can qualify for the benefits of the USMCA. And it seems likely that these car makers will begin or expand production of engines and or transmissions in North America, since those two elements together account for about 30% of the value of a car. And the US is a more likely choice than Mexico, in this case, for the labor content rules, which I'm going to go on to in a moment. Just briefly on apparel, the new agreement strengthens both the content rules and the enforcement mechanism to ensure that textiles and apparel meet the standards for production within the 3 countries of the agreement. For example, sewing thread, pocketing fabric, narrow elastic bands, and coated fabric, when incorporated in most apparel and other finished products, must be made in the region to qualify for the free trade benefits. In other words, if any one of those elements are not made in the region, then the entire garment does not qualify for free trade benefits. And so there have been clauses like that in the previous NAFTA, and it's now extended to all these other elements of a garment. So that's an expansion of the rules of origin, which should benefit production in certainly in Mexico, and probably, let's hope, also in the US and Canada. Okay, so that's rules of origin. I'll now move on to labor content, and this is particularly interesting. This is the first time that a trade agreement is linking market access to wage levels, and it is, we believe, an important precedent for future trade agreements. The agreement requires workers making $16 an hour or more as their wage to produce 40% of the value of automobiles and 45% of the value of light trucks in order for the finished complete product to qualify for duty-free treatment. This requirement is phased in over 4 years, starting in 2020 and moving through till 2023, when we reach that 40/45% level. Ambassador Lighthizer team felt, and they, as you know, they spoke intensively with the auto industry, and the auto industry wanted some time to adjust to this requirement, and so that's why it's phased in over 4 years. And there's a further level of complication here. The labor value content is a combination of high-wage materials, high-wage technology expenditures, and high-wage assembly expenditures. And the annual, I won't go into great detail, but there's targets set for each of those 3 components of the vehicle. The largest piece is the manufacturing and assembly of the vehicle. Technology is second, and then the section that applies to transmission battery assembly is third. But the point is, you add them all together, and you must reach $16 an hour. You must reach 40% of the value, or 45% being produced in a plant paying over $16 an hour to qualify for the free trade benefits. And as you probably know, Mexico is currently paying something like 20% of that $16 to the typical Mexican car worker. So it's going to be many years before Mexico can qualify. So there are two effects we're hoping to see from this. First, pressure to shift some production north of the border into the US or Canada in order to meet this requirement, since both of those countries pay well above $16 an hour. And secondly, it creates an incentive for Mexico to begin to move wages up and hit the $16 an hour mark. And we can all debate how serious and how powerful that incentive will be given the state of Mexican politics and industrial affairs, but at least it's out there now as an incentive. And with that, I will hand the talk back to Michael.
So the next issue is Buy American rules or government procurement rules. And as we had asked that the new agreement not have rules that would require us to treat Mexican and Canadian products as U.S. made for government procurement purposes. There's several, in most trade agreements, they have that the same provision that trade agreement signatories shall be treated as domestic for domestic government procurement programs. And there's a WTO side agreement on it as well. We had asked that that be taken out, but it wasn't. It was not changed in the new agreement. The next issue is investor-state dispute settlement. And this is, what is ISDS? This is, you remember, most treaties like SALT II or, any treaty, Law of the Sea Treaty, if there's a dispute, it's between governments. The investor-state dispute settlement gives citizens who are investors or companies the right to sue governments, which is, again, it's a pretty new thing in treaty law, modern thing. So foreign investors can sue countries for unlimited damages in international tribunals, and they're not really judges like we think of them. They're corporate trade lawyers that they don't have any ethics rules. I see rules as misspelled, and they've represented foreign companies before. You can't appeal. They're a real problem, and so the fair trade groups had a problem with it for those reasons. A lot of companies wanted to have these rights to sue third world countries that we're in trade agreements with, that don't have respected court systems, and so that they could invest there with confidence. But Bob Lighthizer took the proper position that why is it our job to give you confidence to invest in another country? We'd like you to invest here. This amounts to publicly sponsored foreign investment risk insurance. You can buy that on the private market if you want foreign investment risk insurance. So that's largely, this is a good thing. We asked that it go away. It largely did. As between the U.S. and Canada, there's a 3-year, it's terminated within 3 years of the agreement, which reduces our ISDS liability from other countries by quite a bit. As to Mexico, it expires mostly. It's maintained in a few sectors like oil and gas, but then only investors have to exhaust domestic remedies first before they can file under the USMCA agreement. In other words, they have to bring a case in Mexican courts first and exhaust those remedies, not go direct to the International Tribunal. So while it was a compromise from our initial position and Bob Lighthizer's initial position, it's still a pretty good result. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff for the next section.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the sunset clause in the agreement. The USMCA is the first trade agreement to include a termination date. The previous trade agreements were envisaged to be forever under the view of the globalist view that trade could only ever be good, and we were heading towards a great big or more parties, in this case 3 parties. But the way in which this has been implemented is a little bit complicated. The agreement must be renewed after 16 years. Ambassador Lighthizer came in asking for 5, so the move to 16 reflects the fact that the other two countries did not want to go down this road, so the compromise was reached at 16 years. However, there is a provision that the three parties meet after 6 years, and if they agree to continue the agreement at that point, it will run for a further 16 years. If they do not agree that the agreement has served them all well, then annual reviews will take place of the agreement each year from then on. But the agreement does not actually end at that point. So you could argue that it has a termination date, but it doesn't have an automatic mechanism to terminate. As I say, it's complex. However, a party can withdraw from the USMCA at any point simply by providing written notice to the other two parties with a 6-month notice period. So one of the key issues here is investor certainty or uncertainty. In other words, the globalists and I think the other two governments here want to create investor certainty to encourage investors to invest outside the United States, whereas we believe, or Ambassador Lighthizer and the CPA believe, it's an uncertain world. The interest of the US government is in supporting investment in the US to boost our own economy and create jobs here. So why do we want to reassure investors? So you've got a 16-year lifespan, you've got a 6-year threshold at which point people get together and assess this agreement, and you can bet that will be in the public eye. So will that create enough investor uncertainty to slow down or stop multinationals investing outside the US? You know, I think it's hard to say at this point. It's so early in the life of the agreement. All I'd say is that what I mentioned earlier about a number of very large car companies already talking about boosting investment in the United States is a positive sign from my point of view. But the sunset clause is definitely a complex situation. Okay, Michael, back to you now.
Thank you, Jeff. So the next item is the currency provision. So the Ambassador Lighthizer did want a provision on currency in the agreement. We have asked for strong enforceable currency disciplines in the TPP and in other agreements in the past. CPA, you know, currency has been a big issue for us for a long time. As our understanding has evolved of what's going on, when the era of manipulation has ebbed a bit, it can come back at times. There's still some countries manipulating, but we see that the dollar, the flip side of a manipulation and devaluation is that the U.S. dollar is overvalued, making our goods and services more expensive, less competitive, making the imported goods and services cheaper. Indeed, the dollar's rise this year is a case in point, in that it's offsetting a large part of the, if you know, depending on how you calculate it, a large part or more than the tariffs. So currency, our dollar going up has been sucking in imports and deterring exports. Again, frustrating some of the intent of the tariffs. So the USMCA does cover currency manipulation, and good for Ambassador Lighthizer for pushing it and for getting Treasury to agree to it, because Treasury has balked in past administrations. The reporting, there are certain reporting provisions that they must report on their interventions in the market, central bank interventions. Those are enforceable. The provisions saying thou shalt not manipulate are not enforceable. So there was something going on with the parties there. We have a little bit of trouble with the language now, because there is a promotion of the agreement says the exchange rate shall be market determined. And one of our problems, we have a little heartburn with that, because we want to actually be able to push back against the exchange rates when the market determines them and they are, they're, again, overvalued. Because the U.S., as you may have seen in our other literature, and if you haven't signed our currency petition on the CPA homepage, you should. The market, because we're the world's reserve currency, we're an invoicing currency. Countries trade, third countries trade invoicing in dollars. We're an investment and safe harbor currency. When people want to invest and store money safely, they use dollars. When Turkey, you know, has a hiccup or crashes, they flee and invest in dollars. Argentina, ditto. It pushes our dollar up. too high above a rate that is unable to adjust downward to get to a place where we can balance trade. So the point is, we are concerned that the market-determined exchange rate language could prohibit us in the future from taking action to push the dollar towards a level that would balance trade. And we're starting to engage with USTR on that. We do share the same goals with them, and we'll be engaging them in the next weeks. Okay, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Michael. Let's talk about the trucking industry. This agreement appears to be a very significant win for the U.S. trucking industry, and our Teamster member of our board is happy with the agreement. What the agreement does is it specifically addresses long-held concerns about environmental and safety issues concerning Mexican domiciled long-haul trucks traveling on U.S. roads. There's a prohibition on Mexican carriers hauling freight between points within the U.S. In addition, the U.S. Department of Transportation can cap the number of Mexican domiciled carriers who can receive U.S. operating authority. And this followed a case years ago that Mexico brought using WTO rules to basically force the U.S. to open up its market to Mexican truckers, and Teamsters felt strongly that this was a safety issue for U.S. roads and U.S. drivers, and the agreement has now addressed this issue very effectively from what we're told. Furthermore, in an annex to the agreement, U.S. regulators are allowed to make changes to the number of entrants to the cross-border program if they find that these limitations are required to be changed to address material harm or the threat of material harm to U.S. suppliers, operators, or drivers. So it really seems like we've got an agreement here that's going to benefit the U.S. trucking industry.
Yeah, this is a first in that the labor unions have always opposed trade agreements. So far, this could be one of the first ones that they support, be at least neutral, if not support. And this trucking issue is part of it. So are the labor standards issue that we'll discuss in a moment. So the labor standards in the USMCA are stronger than in past trade deals. They've tended to be in sort of side agreements, not in the core text of the agreement. This one includes obligations regarding preventing violence, regarding violence, migrant workers, right to strike, prohibitions on forced labor and child labor, which would apply, especially with Mexico, which would be the concern. We already meet these standards. And so the point is to require Mexico to upgrade its labor practices and hopefully upgrade their, the worker all-in wages and make them less of a low-wage competitor to us. There's an annex detailing how Mexico is going to be reforming its labor laws. There's, some have criticized the agreement, saying that the ILO or the International Labor Organization standards are followed as opposed to, in its declaration, as opposed to a stronger standard in its convention. So the unions are looking at that. Two key clauses could water down the effectiveness because the labor violations must be in a manner affecting trade or investment. If you follow this sort of thing, there's been only one case brought for violations of labor standards by another country because they're hard to, bring, or it's hard to get a country to be persuaded to bring it. And it was against Guatemala. And essentially the tribunal found, yes, Guatemala did violate the standards, did bad things, but it was not in a manner affecting trade or investment. So they didn't get, it's kind of an escape clause loophole from the labor point of view. And the enforceability of the clause is unclear. So I know the unions, the AFL-CIO and the Teamsters and the like are looking down the road toward the implementing legislation, because the agreement gets into U.S. law by implementing legislation, which makes the changes to U.S. law that are consistent with the agreement. So that's what the labor unions are focused on right now. The next issue is food safety standards. We had talked, our goal was to raise food safety standards for imported food, and they mostly didn't touch that from the NAFTA. The text generally, there's the trade facilitation angle. I mean, whenever you hear trade facilitation, it means that just, they want to speed up the cross-border trade without inspections. And so they keep an equivalence assessment, which means that an exporting country can determine if their measures are equivalent to ours. And it's a little easier to get in imported food than under prior standards. So we'd hope for that to be tightened up. There wasn't a large ag biz lobby that was trying to tighten them up, and so that didn't get tightened up. So that was part of our wish list, didn't get in there. Country of origin labeling, we were hoping to get in there. Country of origin labeling was a law that was passed 16 years ago, I believe, that requires all seafood, produce, beef, and pork to be labeled as a country of origin. Canada and Mexico brought a case against the U.S. saying that law was a violation of the WTO agreement. They largely won, and Congress removed or repealed the country of origin labeling in December 2015. We were hoping to address that in the new negotiations, but we're unable to get that done. And we're trying to find, some ways to maybe, do part measures or something like that going forward. So in any event, the meat labeling is still is not addressed in the agreement, and although COOL was not repealed for seafood or produce. The next section is a pretty innovative section. It's all focused on China. Of course, last week was a week that could go down in history with regard to China, because Mike Pence gave a very strong talk before the Hudson Institute, long talk, which was an indictment of China and their core strategy in to become a regional global superpower and being a real problem in the global community and for the U.S. If you haven't listened to it or read the text, I suggest you do so, because it's a big pivot point from before. And also the Pentagon, or the government, released a defense industrial base report analyzing the U.S. defense supply chain. And those of you who are in industry, they went 7 tiers down to look at the defense supply chain and to see if it is if there's security problems with it. If we just have a single source, if we have a single source that's overseas, if we don't have any sufficient domestic sources at critical points in our defense supply chain. They went 7 tiers down, so they reached deeply into the civilian supply chain. And they're working in a whole of government manner to secure the whole defense supply chain, so we're not excessively reliant on foreign countries, especially strategic competitors like China. And so this chapter 32 in the agreement requires the other parties, Mexico and Canada, or anybody, even if we have to give 3 months notice of talks on trade agreements with a non-market economy. Non-market economy means China. Basically, Ambassador Lighthizer, President Trump, they do not want these countries we have trade agreements with making a deal with China, which enables China to transship through them to the U.S. And in fact, we may be in a long-term decoupling stance with China. And this could be the start of just building a new non-China trading bloc and extending our influence to prevent other countries, to bring other countries into the fold of decoupling with China. So this is what this provision is about. If the other country reaches an agreement with China, the text of the agreement must be shared with the other two countries, and we can terminate if we want. Trudeau in Canada does have designs on Asia. He's been criticized as this blocking his ideas of integrating with Asia and China more. He says it won't. Talk is cheap, but this is clearly innovative and part of the great game of great powers that is going on between the U.S. and China. It's pretty significant. The next issue is the state-to-state resolution process, which was adjusted. This is the process by which one country can challenge another country for alleged violations, which is different from the investor-state dispute settlement. This is state-to-state dispute settlement. So simply, there's a more clear and transparent mechanism to resolve disputes, emphasis on cooperative settlement, and if that fails, go to an arbitration process. And there's a process if there's a violation, if the panel finds a violation, the determined wrongful party must take action to remove the violation, so they have a chance to do that first. If they don't remove the violation within a certain period of time, then the winning party can suspend certain benefits of the agreement that are relatively economically equivalent. So there was some adjustment to state dispute resolution. Lighthizer never challenged that because it's pretty clear that if you have any kind of an agreement, states should have a process to resolve it. The issue is whether you give a certain subset of the citizenry direct rights of action against the government, in this case, investors in the investor-state dispute settlement process. Lastly, ratification. People, so the ITC has to do an economic analysis. They have 105 days to do it, which would mean March 2019 for a congressional vote. Everything could be sped up. Excuse me. It's possible we could have a vote by this year. They had initially wanted to have a vote this year before the new Mexican president takes over. So the old Mexican president, or the current one, can sign it, and the new one, who's been more critical of trade agreements and globalization, wouldn't have that on his watch. That doesn't look like it's going to be the case, but you never know. It's possible the agreement wouldn't go into effect till 2020 because all three countries have to approve it, their legislatures. Legislative bodies. Prospects of passage, I know that it's really uncertain. I guess my money is on that it would probably be passed. As we mentioned, we'd like a few tweaks to things along the way, but it'll be presented as, this USMCA or no NAFTA. And so I haven't seen, strong opposition. If Labor doesn't oppose strongly, it'll pick up a lot more Democrats. If the House were to change hands in the fall, we don't know exactly, would the Democrats want to take a position to deny any victory to the president? That's happened before in the reverse situation. But if the labor unions get on board and want it, they'll lobby the Democrats in the Congress to pass it. So it's a bit uncertain. My money is on passage, but it may not be until March of next year. So that ends the presentation. If you have questions, put it in the question box, and we'll unmute you to answer. If you could just say, I have a question, or you can write it. Okay, again, I don't see any questions in the box. On your control panel, okay, I see one. Within your control panel, there's a place that says questions. So Mark Fasto has a question. I'm just going to unmute you, Mark, and Mark Fasto, you are unmuted.
Okay, thanks, guys. So the question is about the auto content rules. It isn't clear to me whether you mean that, say, if 40% has to be made by workers making $16 an hour or more. 40% of what exactly? Is it the total content imported into the U.S., including parts that may have originated in the U.S., gone out to Mexico, and come back? Or is it just components, the content in the auto that is not made in the U.S., say made in China or made in Mexico? That let's say you have $1,000 auto and $800 of it, half of it comes from U.S. components that went into Mexico and then came back, and the other $500 was made in China and Mexico. To which number does the 40% apply?
Jeff?
Mark, this is Jeff, and I'm hoping to have a meeting with the USTR to get some of those details straight, but I think the way it would work is, my best understanding is that you have the value of the car, and I mean, think of, the average car these days is retailing for $30,000, so the cost of goods sold is probably $15,000 or $20,000, and there's going to be an accounting of all the value in that car. And you take that $15,000, and every dollar of it gets assigned to one country or another, to one maker or another, and you evaluate the wages. And 40% of that value has to be produced by workers earning $16 an hour or above. And if not, then the car is deemed not to be a USMCA product, or whatever the term would be.
So
does that make sense to you?
Well, let me see if I understand what you're saying. So if let's say 40% of the cost of the car, the items that cost 40% of the cost of goods sold, are made in the U.S. already by workers making $16 an hour, then that's the end of the inquiry.
Correct. So it is viewed that this will have small impact on the big three, Honda and Toyota, because they already do the bulk of their manufacturing for the U.S. market in the U.S. The reason why I named those 5 companies, take Mercedes as an example, and Volkswagen, they manufacture in Mexico and they ship engines and components in from Europe. So now I guess I'm getting into the rules of origin, where, the two overlap, right? You've got a rules of origin issue, how much originates within the 3 countries, and you've got the 40% rule. So I think the quotes from Volkswagen and Mercedes are saying, when we look at those 2 issues together, it tells us, A, we need to produce more in the 3 countries, and B, we probably are going to lean towards the U.S. because if we produce too much in Mexico, we could fall foul of the 40%, the $16 rule.
So it doesn't really matter whether you're shipping the final assembled car from Mexico in, or whether you're shipping a half assembled car into the U.S. You just look at the final product and look at where the parts were made and what people were paid to make them. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's a true statement.
Okay.
But again, I mean, this is something I really want to, what you're asking is, do we apply it to every single component? It's a good question. Do we apply it to the components individually as well as to the finished car? And, I think we could certainly use some more clarity on that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Then the other question, John DeArmond asked if will the slides be shared with callers so we can review. The answer is yes, we'll share the slides. Are there any other questions? Okay. Oh, good question by Steve Capone. Steve, I'll unmute you and you can ask it orally. Just a second. Stephen, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I'm just curious how this will affect the 232 tariffs. You know, particularly in my case, the steel and aluminum. Are they still in development? Are they still in play, or will they be null and void at this point?
No, they stay in place. They're a separate issue. They're unaffected. They're in place.
Okay, thank you.
And we expect that 232 tariff scenario, as just so you're all clear, is to protect, to get the steel industry in the U.S. to a target capacity of about 80%. That's the national security issue. The national security issue is not whether a country is an ally or an enemy that is coming from. The issue is getting to 80% capacity. And that's why Canada and Mexico had to be part of it, because if you have a program like that to get to that target, you don't have loopholes coming in from certain countries. You have to have a blanket. So every country has either tariffs or quotas. Mostly tariffs, some quotas, but all have tariffs or quotas. And we are pretty confident that, and certainly, from this agreement we see it, the 232s are going to be the new normal for quite some time. And as they engage in negotiations with Europe and Japan, it is highly likely that the 232s will not be part of those discussions. Okay, John DeArmond says, thank you for the slides. You're very welcome. And Mark Festo asked you to keep them updated on any clarifications you receive, and certainly on in the rules of origin and labor content. There will be more details coming out. The devil is in the details, but it's pretty good stuff. A nice advance. And it's a nice advance over the prior globalization mindset where, for paraphrasing the WTO, well, not paraphrasing them, they say, these are products of the world. It doesn't matter where it's made. Well, we think it matters where it's made. We're having a pivot in that direction pretty significantly now. So I'll reiterate also that we have a committee meeting tomorrow. We have trade enforcement committees. We have Buy America committees working on pretty crucial issues. What's tomorrow? Tomorrow is a Buy American committee. We've had some discussions with the White House on labeling. We did know, labeling is a big issue for Buy American. Government procurement is a big issue for our Buy America committee. We're getting into an issue of our pharmaceutical supply chain being at risk because we've offshored a lot of our pharmaceutical products to China. And so that committee is dealing with those issues, and we interact with Peter Navarro's staff periodically because his staff works on Buy America, Hire America issues. That's tomorrow at 2 p.m. So if you want to sign up for that, let me know. You should have gotten emails. There's a trade enforcement committee Thursday at 2 p.m. that we deal with an update on what's going on with trade enforcement issues. A lot of our members are involved with those. And we do have a CPA tax committee too. We just had our first meeting last month where we're looking at an America First tax system to position a new tax reform for the next time they address tax reform that will be even better, or depending on how you thought of this last tax reform, some love it, some hate it, but it'll be better in either case. With value-added tax issues addressed and some other issues addressed. So like to keep you involved and would like to serve you better. Any way we can serve you better where we're falling down on the job, please let us know. because we want you to feel that we are doing what you expect when you're one of our members. We want to get better at our job every day. So thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, and have a great day. Bye-bye.